This subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on ending the weaponization of the Justice Department. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Alabama who is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we will remain standing for a moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, Mr. Hunt of Texas will be permitted to participate in today's hearing for the purpose of questioning the witnesses, if a member yields time to him for that purpose. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Welcome, everyone, to the first hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight. Today, we are here to shine a light on something that should be deeply concerning to every single American: how our justice system was allowed to become weaponized against political opponents. Early in his presidency, Joe Biden told the nation, "It's not my Justice Department, it's the Justice Department." Former Attorney General Merrick Garland promised the same thing. That was their promise, but we now know it was a lie. For the past 4 years, it was not the People's Justice Department. It was a political weapon used to go after anybody the Biden-Harris administration felt needed to be attacked. Let me lay it out clearly, case after case, so there's no confusion on what happened. Let's start in the great state of New York. Alvin Bragg ran for Manhattan DA, focused on only one thing: targeting Donald Trump instead of cleaning up the many problems facing New York City. After years of searching, he revived a dismissed case with the help of former DOJ officials and used a shaky legal theory to turn misdemeanors into felonies. And it wasn't just Bragg. New York's Attorney General Letitia James also made it her mission to go after President Trump. She campaigned on it. Prosecutors, attorney generals, they shouldn't campaign on politics. They should campaign on justice. She campaigned on it, and she promised voters she'd, quote, exact quote, "get Trump," before even seeing a shred of evidence. And sure enough, once in office, she followed through, twisting civil statutes into weapons for political gain, targeting not just Trump, but his entire family business. In Fulton County, Georgia, Fani Willis also campaigned on prosecuting President Trump. She coordinated with the partisan January 6th committee and the Biden White House from Georgia and hired her romantic partner as the lead prosecutor. Couldn't make this stuff up. I guess office romances can sometimes take you places. For Fani Willis and Nathan Wade, it was tropical destinations. It was luxury hotels, all on the taxpayer's dime. And while they were busy enjoying the perks, the cases they were building against Trump were falling apart under the weight of conflicts and impropriety, because it was pure political lawfare. I want to just note, no one should run for DA, AG, or any legal office. Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, nobody should do this with the sole goal of going after one political figure. It's not what those jobs are about. That's not justice. That's vengeance. Our legal system isn't supposed to be about personal grudges or political payback. It's about fairness. It's about impartiality. It's about the rule of law. That's supposed to be the standard in America. Unfortunately, under President Biden, that standard wasn't just abandoned at the state level, it was shattered. It was shattered at the federal level as well. Jack Smith was unconstitutionally appointed as special counsel. His lead counsel pressured a defense attorney with a judgeship offer to flip a client. So if the client flipped, he'd get a judgeship. Smith admitted to altering evidence in the Mar-a-Lago case, evidence tampering at the highest and most important level, pure political lawfare. The FBI conducted an unprecedented raid on Mar-a-Lago, the home of a former president. They ignored standard protocol. They didn't wait for President Trump's lawyers to respond. They didn't use a local field office, and they bypassed all typical legal channels. Pure political lawfare. The FBI also targeted religious institutions. You couldn't make this up again. And parents. They labeled traditionalist Catholics as domestic terrorists, traditional Roman Catholics as domestic terrorists, and considered spying on their churches, on their priests, on their parishioners. Think about that. I really want everybody to think about it. Forget the politics for a minute. The FBI was planning to spy on grandmothers clutching their rosary beads in prayer, treating them as if they were a national security threat. If they can do this to Catholic churches, and this is the important part, what's stopping them from doing it in any place of worship, to Protestant churches, to Jewish synagogues, to Muslim mosques, or to Hindu temples? It was Catholic churches one day. It could be any of those another day. It could be you. If you think that sounds far-fetched, I want you to just take a look, if you get a chance, to what they did in my home state. In New Jersey, the FBI raided the largest Hindu temple in the Western Hemisphere, home to some of the most peaceful and spiritual people on the face of the earth, Hindus. Biden's FBI stormed the temple. He invaded private quarters, religious areas, and held guns. They held guns to the faces of swamis, holy men, some of whom were wearing nothing but their evening wear, their night wear, their pajamas. These are individuals devoted to peace, nonviolence, and prayer, yet they were treated like dangerous criminals in an aggressive show of force. It's wrong. It's un-American. And it didn't stop at places of worship. The DOJ also turned its sight onto parents, moms and dads, grandparents who dared to speak up for their children at local school board meetings. Instead of seeing concerned citizens, the Biden administration saw potential domestic threats. They used counterterrorism resources to monitor and intimidate parents simply for voicing their concerns about what was happening to their own children in their own classrooms. The DOJ even weaponized the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrance Act, the FACE Act, to target pro-life advocates. This doesn't even matter if you're pro-life or pro-choice. Again, it could happen to anybody. Take Mark Houck, a peaceful pro-life activist and father of 7 kids. In a blatant show of force, the FBI sent a SWAT team to his home, raiding it, and a pre-dawn raid with guns drawn, terrifying his wife and his children. Whether it's people praying in churches or parents speaking out at school board meetings, the message from the DOJ, from Biden's DOJ, is clear. If you practice your First Amendment rights in ways they don't like, you will become a target. Could happen to any one of us. This is pure political lawfare. The Justice Department slow-walked the investigation into Hunter Biden, allowing statutes of limitations to expire, tipping off defense lawyers about search warrants, and ultimately offering a sweetheart plea deal that nobody else would ever get. Meanwhile, the DOJ was slow-walking investigations that might make the president look bad. The full force of the DOJ was aimed at President Trump and any, even worse yet, people that didn't sign up for this, any of his allies. Just look at the timeline. After announcing his candidacy, President Trump was indicted 4 times, twice by partisan DAs and twice by an unconstitutionally appointed special counsel. I'm sure my Democratic colleagues will say that it was not coordinated, but it was. And I'll say it was pure political warfare. What I've laid out is just the framework of what this Judiciary Committee uncovered last Congress. It was the work of this Judiciary Committee and our chairman, Jim Jordan, that did that. My colleagues, we will dig deeper into each case. I pledge to you that this committee, this subcommittee, is going to dig deep and dig hard and find out the real truth. And the reason is not because we want to rehash everything in that ugly, ugly past. The reason is we never, ever want it to happen again. It shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or conservative. It could happen to you. I want you to really think about it. It could happen to your church. It could happen to your mosque. It could happen to your synagogue. It could happen to your temple. It could happen to your school. It could happen to your cause, whether on the right or the left. It could happen to your beliefs. It's un-American. It's wrong. This should never happen again. Our justice system should be blind to politics, blind to personal beliefs, and focused solely on fairness and the law. Under Attorney General Pam Bondi's leadership, this administration, this Congress, and this subcommittee are working to restore integrity to the DOJ for everyone, all of us. We will ensure that never again will our justice system be used as a political weapon. I thank our witnesses, all of you, for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Crockett.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is my first time serving as a ranking member of a subcommittee during a hearing, and I am grateful to be here today. I look forward to working with you and the rest of this committee on behalf of the American people. Before I was elected to Congress or to the Texas House of Representatives, I was a public defender and civil rights attorney by trade. I know about the Department of Justice and what they're supposed to be doing. I am also very concerned by a rogue DOJ, or one that is not beholden to the American people. I am very concerned about the DOJ being weaponized by the White House. I am concerned about the FBI being used for purposes outside of our domestic security and maintaining peace at home. So, weaponization of the Department of Justice. This phrase, the weaponization of government, is something that has been overly used and repeated by my Republican colleagues. They use it as a war cry, a battle call, to justify dismantling federal agencies and the purging of thousands of hardworking, dedicated federal servants who swore an oath to protect the Constitution and the rule of law. If the purpose of this hearing today is to examine and expose the weaponization of government, specifically the weaponization of Department of Justice, then it is essential that we understand what exactly weaponization means. Fortunately, history is kind to us. Last Congress, the House Judiciary Committee held numerous hearings on this notion of weaponization. And in those hearings, Republicans described weaponization as, quote, corruption, quote, government abuse and political treachery, having the government act, quote, against people who were innocent and did nothing wrong, quote, targeting people of one political persuasion. And as one of my colleagues aptly described, quote, if you speak up about the abuses you are seeing, excuse me, or are sharing information that may not fall in line with the political narrative, you will be suspended without pay, have your security clearance revoked, or your life will be turned upside down. It's pretty clear that the MO is, if you don't comply, they will retaliate. If you don't agree with their political agenda, you get suspended. They do it in such a way to deter others from speaking up and speaking out. These are not my words. These are not the words of Ranking Member Raskin or Leader Jeffries. These are the words of congressional Republicans. This is what they believe embodies weaponization. I am the first to admit that I don't often agree with many things that my Republican colleagues say, but wholeheartedly concur with their descriptions here. What concerns me, however, is the inability of my colleagues on the other side to connect the dots that are in front of them, while the rest of America is watching as this DOJ weaponization takes hold right before our eyes. And to be clear, what we are witnessing happening before us satisfies the descriptions used by my Republican colleagues. Corruption. Any lawyer with a good head on their shoulders will tell you that the recent attempt by Trump's DOJ to drop the corruption case against Mayor Adams is ironically riddled with corruption itself. This decision to try and drop this case was never about some flawed argument or approach by the DOJ. In fact, even acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais, in his February 10th letter to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, the office handling the case stated that the Department of Justice's attempt to drop this was done, quote, without assessing the strength of the evidence or legal theories on which the case is based inherited. Instead, it is trying to drop the case because Trump's DOJ is, quote, particularly concerned about the impact of the prosecution on Mayor Adams' ability to support critical ongoing federal efforts to protect the American people from the disastrous effects of unlawful mass immigration and resettlement. Put differently, the Department of Justice wants Mayor Adams to give fealty to Trump and also use him to execute Trump's immigration policy in New York City. The blatant corruption of this quid pro quo alone should warrant this subcommittee to investigate the current weaponization of this Department of Justice. But this is far from the only example of weaponization occurring before us. Next, government abuse and political treachery. Make no mistake, acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais ordering Brian Driscoll, the then acting director of the FBI, to turn over a list of not just current but also former FBI staff who were assigned, quote, at any time to investigations and or prosecutions related to the events that occurred at or near the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, end quote. It is a clear illustration of government abuse targeting employees they wrongfully claim are political adversaries. In fact, rather than utilize the FBI's time and resources to protect America from cyber attacks, terrorism, and other violent crimes, Trump's DOJ is choosing to spend resources to build loyalty to Trump. If that is not government abuse, I just don't know what is. Third, the view that the government is acting, quote, against people who were innocent and did nothing wrong. For those of you who may not be familiar, when career prosecutors and staff at DOJ are assigned to cases, they take these tasks on not because of power or politics, but because it is quite simply part of the job. It's rare that prosecutors get every case they want. Instead, prosecutors and staff are assigned cases because of their capacity, experience, and expertise. But where we see commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law, the Trump DOJ sees reason for retribution. This has already taken shape in various forms, but notably, on January 27th, Trump's then acting Attorney General James McHenry fired DOJ officials, on those of which worked on federal criminal investigations into Trump. Let me repeat this. They fired DOJ officials who did nothing wrong. These officials simply did their jobs. Now finally, quote, targeting people of one political persuasion. While I just briefly touch on this point, I want to be very clear with the American people. Within the last 35 days, Trump's DOJ has already sent inquiry letters to Democratic members of Congress for speaking out and criticizing Elon Musk. Our task on this subcommittee today is to conduct real congressional oversight of the Department of Justice, because this notion of weaponization is not simply a threat, it is a reality. The public is worried. Career attorneys are worried. Congress is worried. The world is worried. Every day that passes, the Department of Justice is losing institutional knowledge and exceptional attorneys because of a blind arrogance and vengeance. We owe it to this country to come together to call out weaponization happening today, to call out corruption, government abuse, attacks on innocent people, and the targeting of people with different political views. We owe it to everyone to speak the truth, even if the truth is hard to hear. We owe it to us all to preserve our country's rule of law. And the final point that I'll make is that there were a number of attorneys that were brought up in the chairman's opening remarks. Attorney General Letitia James of New York, as well as DA Fani Willis. I do want to point out that each of these women are women that were duly elected in their states, and Fani Willis was just reelected. That is not federal lawfare. That is not weaponization of the federal government. Both of those women work on the state level. And the final point that I'll make is that while they work on state levels, there were only a certain amount of cases that were able to be tried prior to the election. Any cases that did take place, whether they were civil cases or federal cases, I do want to point out, regardless of who brought those cases ultimately, at least the ones that did go, they ultimately went to juries. They went to juries that were full of American citizens, juries that were not asked, are you going to sit here and support Donald Trump and his agenda, or do you have some left-wing agenda? They were given an opportunity to hear the evidence, and they were able to rule based on the evidence that was presented to them. I am someone who misses the courtroom every single day, as I practiced for 17 years before entering into Congress. And if we continue to pretend as if the voices of everyday American citizens don't matter when they have an opportunity to listen to both sides of a case and make a decision, then we really are in for a rude awakening in this country. One thing that we should do as members of Congress is we should preserve our institutions and make sure we build them up to the point that people have trust. And when you walk into a courtroom, you have no idea who's walking in and who just decided that they would actually show up for jury duty. And I am here to tell you that I still believe in that imperfect but beautiful system that we have in this country, known as the jury system. And with that, I will yield.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Quickly point out that the President did ask his attorneys for a neutral venue and was denied during some of those cases. And Judge Marchand himself was very politically connected, particularly through his daughter. However, I did want to make an announcement. This room, this is a one-time only appearance pretty much here. Kind of scheduling issues for now on for those who come regularly will be in the other room that usually the Judiciary Committee is in. I now recognize the great chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Jim Jordan, for his opening statement.
I don't know about the great part, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. They can never tell us who planted the pipe bombs on January 6th. They can never tell us who leaked the Dobbs opinion, and they can never tell us who put cocaine at the White House. But they sure had time for a lot of other things. October 2nd, 2021, they set up a snitch line to report moms and dads who have the nerve to show up at a school board meeting and advocate for their son or daughter. On September 23rd, 2022, 10 unmarked cars pull up to Mark Houck's home, arrest him in front of his wife and 7 children. And what did he do wrong? What did he do wrong? Praying in front of an abortion clinic. And when some crazy guy comes up and starts yelling obscenities in his kid's face, he makes sure he deals with that guy. He went to court. The jury found him not guilty. On November 18th, 2022, the chairman talked about this. Actually before that, summer of 2022, raid on President Trump's home. President Trump's attorney said, you can come. They were working with him. No, we got to do a raid. We had actually Mr. Stephen D'Antuono, head of the Washington field office, tell us how wrong that was, how they broke all kinds of protocol. 2 months later, Mr. Garland appoints Jack Smith as special prosecutor. And as the chairman pointed out in his opening statement, the lead prosecutor, Jay Bratt, used the promise of a judgeship to try to pressure one of the defendant's lawyers. You're not allowed to do that. We're going to talk to Mr. Bratt at some point in this committee. We'll have him in for a deposition. January 23rd, 2023, FBI Richmond field office issues a memorandum where it says, if you're a pro-life Catholic, you might be a domestic violent extremist. Can't tell us who put cocaine at the White House, but you can call Catholics extremists. Spring of 2023, 2 brave whistleblowers come forward and tell us about the sweetheart deal that David Weiss was trying to do for Hunter Biden. Of course, those guys' reward for coming forward as good, brave whistleblowers was to have their security clearances taken from them and be retaliated against. 6:01 a.m., March 19th, 2024, Brian Malinowski, Little Rock, Arkansas, highest paid official in the Little Rock government, runs the Bill and Hillary Clinton Airport. 6:01, all these folks show up in the morning. First thing they do is put tape on the doorbell cam, and they're coming after Mr. Malinowski, a warrant, search his home, because they believed he had sold 6 guns that he wasn't supposed to sell. 6:01, tape on the doorbell cam. 53 seconds later, Brian Malinowski shot in the head, later dies. They could have handled that. So, I mean, the SWAT team and everything else, just talk to his lawyers. You could have, all kinds of ways you could have handled that to avoid the terrible outcome. We had Brian Malinowski's spouse here last Congress. His lawyer testified. Tragic story because of this Justice Department, the previous Justice Department, the way they handled things. And don't forget, December 12, 2024, when the Inspector General told us about the 26 confidential human sources who were there on January 6, 2021. 17 went in restricted space, which they were not authorized to do. 4 went in the Capitol, which they were not authorized to do. None of them were charged. 2 of the 4 who went in the Capitol were asked to be there by the FBI. We got all kinds of questions about that incident, about those confidential human sources, all kinds of questions we want answered. Now, thank goodness, and the chairman referenced this as well, thank goodness Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, Kash Patel, Dan Bongino are now going to be running the Justice Department, where we won't have this kind of ridiculous focus on agencies being turned on the very people they're supposed to serve. We sent 7 subpoenas today. 7 subpoenas that we sent asking for information about all these issues. We want everything you got so the American people have answers. Maybe it's not as bad as I think, but one thing I've learned in my time in Congress with these investigations, every single time, the only thing we get wrong is it's always worse than we thought. It is always worse than we thought. So maybe I'll be proven wrong this time, but we're going to get that information. I think the date's March 7th. They're supposed to have this information back to us. So I want to thank the chairman and the good work I know he's going to do this Congress, the great work he's done on our committee for having this hearing, taking a look back at what we saw from this ridiculous previous Justice Department and the good work I think we're going to see from the folks who are now running that critical department and agency. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very kindly. Last Congress, the good chairman of the committee and the committee sent over 150 letters of inquiry and subpoenas to the DOJ and the FBI. That's more than 2 inquiries a week for every week that we were in session. All that breathless investigation didn't yield much evidence of weaponization any more than it led to the impeachment of Joe Biden, which was the express objective of it all. But I have good news for all of the weaponized sleuths and gumshoes out there on the committee. The Department of Justice and the FBI are now filled with actual staggering corruption and weaponized lawlessness, and we should get on it immediately. It's only been 36 days since the beginning of the administration, but we already have a thick report we're releasing today on the violations of law and the Constitution that have taken place, the early misdeeds of the Trump administration DOJ. It's true the federal courts have issued more than 20 temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions to try to stop this governmental crime wave, but we cannot maintain a demure legislative silence, Mr. Chairman, about the shocking weaponized corruption overtaking the U.S. Department of Justice. 10 days ago, 7 career prosecutors resigned in protest rather than carry out a corrupt and lawless order from the acting Deputy Attorney General and former Donald Trump private defense attorney, Emile Beauvais. He ordered prosecutors in the Southern District to dismiss for totally political reasons a major public corruption case against New York Mayor Eric Adams,
who had been charged by a unanimous grand jury in a 57-page indictment with 5 felony counts of criminal bribery and soliciting illegal contributions. Trump ordered DOJ to withdraw the grand jury indictment after Adams traveled to Mar-a-Lago and agreed to back Trump's political agenda in return. The interim U.S. attorney, Danielle Sassoon, resigned rather than make her storied office a party to this profoundly corrupt bargain. She refused to extend prosecutorial favoritism towards a politician who had been indicted for serious bribery and corruption charges, nor would she participate in Mr. Beauvais' project to cover up the details of this dirty deal. Ms. Sassoon is a Republican with impeccable credentials in the conservative movement, for anyone who might doubt it, a member of the Federalist Society and a former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Scalia, a jurist whom I know the chairman has repeatedly praised. Now, in ordinary times, we wouldn't have to raise this, but here we do, because we live in an atmosphere of political paranoia. This is a very conservative U.S. attorney who said she could not abide the corruption of the new Trump administration's Department of Justice. Her resignation triggered a cascade of further resignations as 6 other veteran prosecutors refused in their turn to take part in this corrupt bargain. The officials included the acting head of the criminal division, several leaders of DOJ's public integrity section, and the lead prosecutor on the case from the Southern District, Hagan Scotton, a decorated veteran, and another Republican with impeccable right-wing credentials who could not stomach the thought of joining this plot and said in a letter for the ages that I will submit to the record that it would take a fool or a coward to join this plot against justice. The next day, an apparently exasperated Mr. Beauvais demanded that the career prosecutors in the public integrity section volunteer one lawyer to sign this disgraceful dismissal order, or there would be a mass firing of all of them. One lawyer set to retire agreed to sign the dismissal to protect his colleagues from this outrageous threat of collective mass punishment, something that would be more appropriate to Stalin's Russia than the United States of America. This eye-popping sellout of public integrity and public safety in New York wasn't even a secret. In a Fox News interview, Tom Homan, the border czar, sat next to Mayor Adams and explicitly referred to the corrupt bargain, saying, quote, "If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York and we won't be sitting on a couch. I'll be in his office up his butt saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?" Last Friday, the judge in the case at least provisionally refused to honor this dirty deal, instead appointing an independent monitor, Republican Paul Clement, to evaluate what should be done with the now orphaned 5-count criminal corruption indictment. Mr. Chairman, these facts are shocking. Blatant corruption, cover-up, mass resignations, threats, coercion. This, can you imagine what the Republican members of this committee would be saying if that happened under President Biden? If Joe Biden had done that for the corrupt Democratic mayor of New York City? My God. This toxic sweetheart deal demands a committee inquiry. Where is it? It's infinitely worse than any of the flotsam and jetsam the committee examined with the brainy intensity of Lieutenant Columbo in the last Congress. But the majority has asked no questions, written no letters, demanded no briefings, issued no subpoenas on this scandal. Why not? Why's the cat got your tongue? Well, this Adams debacle provides just a whiff of the raw sewage already overpouring the Department of Justice. They sacked dozens of prosecutors with superior credentials and evaluations simply for doing their jobs when they were assigned to work on the January 6th case. These people must get their jobs back under the civil service rules, which allow dismissal and discipline only for poor performance or misconduct, but the majority has not uttered a peep wondering about how such an appalling violation of the law and professional ethics has come to pass. Why not? Last Congress, you investigated the DOJ for allegedly hiring and firing employees based on political ideology. Nothing came of it. Now DOJ has openly fired dozens of career prosecutors, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, for the sole reason that they were assigned to work on the January 6th insurrection cases. In other words, for doing their jobs. in a case that Donald Trump now considers uncomfortable for him. How is that remotely acceptable? Even Trump said on January 7th, in the wake of the vicious, premeditated attack on our police and our Congress and our Constitution, that it was a heinous attack. He said the demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. To those who engage in the acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country. And to those who broke the law, he said, you will pay. Well, the only people paying now, after his pardons, are the prosecutors and FBI agents they're going after for doing their jobs. Because Donald Trump thinks it's too much truth. In an act of Orwellian revisionism that would make Joseph Stalin blush, Trump's team wants to punish hardworking prosecutors and FBI agents for doing the job they were told to do. If this is not weaponization of the Department of Justice, then what is, Mr. Chairman? It is far worse than the imaginary things floating around last Congress that led nowhere. When will we have a hearing on what is taking place for real in the Department of Justice right now? They've hollowed out the career leadership ranks at DOJ, ravaging the offices that prosecute public corruption and terrorism. Now we meet Ed Martin, the new U.S. attorney in D.C., who's already proven himself to be to legal ethics what Bobby Kennedy is to public health. He's an election denier who participated in the insurrectionary mass protest of January 6th, which he joyfully likened to Mardi Gras on the social media. And until recently, very recently in fact, into his term of office, he's been a defense lawyer of record in the courts for numerous January 6th criminal defendants. After taking over the U.S. Attorney's Office, he fired dozens of prosecutors, again, for doing their jobs, for prosecuting January 6 rioters. But DOJ ethics rules plainly require that he recuse himself because of this glaring conflict of interest created by his ongoing representation of private plaintiffs being prosecuted by the government. Naturally, the Trump DOJ forced out the senior ethics official, Brad Weinsheimer, who would have ruled on the matter, and replaced him with two inexperienced political appointees who apparently think it's okay, not just for the fox to guard the henhouse, but for the fox to simultaneously represent other foxes in court who have already ravaged the henhouse. Mr. Martin has literally made filings on both sides of January 6th cases as defense counsel for participants in the riot, and now as a prosecutor dismissing the charges against the same defendants he was representing. When will there be a hearing on this? This is taking place right now. The list goes on. We don't have time to go through everything that's already happened, but I would encourage the chairman to please check out our report. This hearing was entitled, Entering the Golden Age, Ending the Weaponization at the Department of Justice, a title that comes just in time to help us celebrate the 50th anniversary of Saturday Night Live. Well, perhaps the title's referring to a golden age for corrupt billionaires or lawless oligarchs and violent white nationalists, but it's no golden age for the Department of Justice, which is now mired in corruption and lawlessness, halting corruption prosecutions, disbanding the anti-corruption task forces, and purging veteran prosecutors and agents who are dedicated to public safety and have superior performance evaluations, but have run afoul of the new political correctness imposed on the department. Chairman Jordan has championed our power under Article 1 to ensure that the Department of Justice upholds the rule of law for all, without fear or favor. Good for him. I don't need to quote his eloquent speeches for you on the subject. We know them well. So I ask this committee to be true to our own beautiful words. Let's not use our oversight power selectively. Let's investigate these startling developments so dangerous to justice in America. And let's start with the dirty deal with Mayor Adams, which has now put a giant worm in the Big Apple. Mr. Chairman, I would invite you to join us in sending this letter today to Attorney General Bondi demanding specific answers on her shocking abuse of prosecutorial power, the shocking abuse of prosecutorial power that has taken place at DOJ in the whole Mayor Adams matter, and I would think that the committee should move very quickly to have a hearing on this next week. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Real quickly, Pam Bondi will be here for the Committee of the Whole, I'm sure, and members also will meet some of her staff and ranking people. They will be at this committee as well. I would maintain the attorneys were removed not because they were doing a great job, because they weren't doing their job and they were involved in lawfare, and that's the point. With that, Mr. Raskin, I believe you wanted to enter something in the record?
Yes, please. Two things. One is the letter to Attorney General Bondi, and the other is our new report, President Trump's New Gilded Age, how Trump's Department of Justice is promoting political and corporate corruption to benefit his most loyal supporters.
Without objection. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. First, Mr. Chris Swecker. Mr. Swecker is a former FBI agent who retired as the Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigations Unit. He served with the Bureau for 24 years. It's a while. He currently practices law in the great state of North Carolina. Mr. Jonathan Fahey. Mr. Fahey is a partner with Holtzman Vogel, where his practice focuses on investigations and white-collar criminal defense. He previously served in various roles in the Department of Homeland Security and as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia. Mr. Peter Breen. Mr. Breen is the Executive Vice President and Head of Litigation at the Thomas More Society, a public interest law firm focused on constitutional rights. Mr. Breen successfully defended Mark Houck, a pro-life advocate, against FACE Act charges brought by the Biden-Harris administration. Mr. Brendan Ballou. Mr. Ballou is a former federal prosecutor. He served with the Justice Department for 5 years. We welcome all our witnesses today and thank them for appearing here. We will begin by swearing you in. Please rise. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? So help you God. Okay, you may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Mr. Swecker, you may begin.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to appear at this hearing today. As mentioned, I have over 42 years of active experience in the criminal justice system as a prosecutor, as an agent, and as an attorney. And that informs my testimony today. I served under 7 FBI directors, 7 attorney generals. While attorney generals are cabinet appointments and politics goes with the position, this should not be the case with the FBI director, who has a 10-year term that was designed to insulate the position from politics. Indeed, during my 24 years in the FBI, I can attest that politics did not drive the initiation or conduct of any investigation, and cases were not pursued for political purposes. Sadly, that has not been the case at the DOJ and FBI since at least 2016. And I'm not here to convey my political views. I know how federal investigations flow, however, and I know the laws, policies, and procedures that govern FBI and DOJ operations. I am familiar with the works of this committee, as well as the DOJ Inspector General Horowitz, Special Counsel Durham, and all the relevant investigations from Crossfire Hurricane to the Mar-a-Lago raid. Many official actions taken by DOJ and FBI in the last 8 years were simply wrong. And I share the goals of this subcommittee that these agencies should never again be used as political weapons. The facts speak for themselves. The U.S. DOJ and its agencies have effectively been used as political weapons. This has taken the form of selective and hyper-aggressive prosecutions of political opponents, while slow-walking and even sabotaging investigations of favored political figures. There has been coordination with and even funding of state prosecutions of Donald Trump. There has been use of some of the most intrusive techniques available against political opponents of Joe Biden, and injection of personal animus and political views into investigations and prosecutions. Much of this weaponization was driven by an entrenched group of ideologues within the DOJ and FBI in perfect alignment with the Biden administration that can't be chalked up to coincidence. A well-known example is Crossfire Hurricane, a notoriously unpredicated investigation of the 2016 Trump presidential campaign tainted by 4 FISA surveillance orders based on deliberately false information contained in opposition research. This was accompanied by an unprecedented infiltration of the campaign by multiple informants. Crossfire Hurricane further involved the potential entrapment of a cabinet-level appointee based on the pretext of an introductory intelligence briefing, and rather than target the Russian influencers and protect the unwitting campaign operatives, the FBI targeted the Trump presidential campaign through those operatives. Note that when similar information was developed about the Hillary Clinton campaign, she was immediately afforded a defensive briefing. Undeterred by the misconduct identified in the DOJ IG Horowitz and Special Counsel Durham reports regarding Crossfire Hurricane, many of the same DOJ and FBI managers opened and pursued a classified documents case on the former president and presidential candidate, culminating in the dawn raid of his personal residence. This was ostensibly to execute a search warrant and was conducted despite ongoing negotiations regarding the declassification and possible return of the documents. After the raid, it was disclosed that Biden had squirreled away classified documents himself. In another example, the inexplicably tepid DOJ-controlled FBI investigation of the Biden family influence peddling schemes, despite the existence of over 170 bank suspicious activity reports, multiple witnesses, 20 offshore corporations, 19 million in potentially illicit proceeds, and from hostile and corrupt foreign governments, oligarchs, and shadowy international characters seeking official favors, and a laptop full of evidence, the investigation languished. It doesn't take a Mensa candidate to surmise that serious criminal activity was afoot that extended well beyond a garden variety tax and firearms case. The case was plagued by interference by DOJ, attempts to slow walk the investigation past the statute of limitations, and a deceptive effort to discredit the laptop. It took an alert federal judge to expose the clever attempt to implement a global plea bargain hidden in a plea agreement to a single firearms charge. The contrast with the multiple scorched earth investigation targeting Donald Trump should be clear to pretty much anyone that's being objective. Since I'm running out of time, I ask that you introduce my full statement into the record. Thank you. And I want to also add, I'm not here in any official capacity for the FBI. As mentioned, I retired from the FBI, so I'm here as a concerned citizen with some experience.
Thank you, Mr. Swecker, and without objection, we will enter the full statement of all of you into the permanent record. Mr. Fahey, you may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jonathan Fahey, and I'm a partner at
Mr. Fahey, I believe your mic is not on.
Oh, okay. Is it on? Okay.
Now, some folks might not like that, but we want to hear you.
Okay. You didn't miss anything at the beginning. I'm a partner of a law firm of Holtzman Vogel, but most of my career practice in law, I served as a prosecutor both at the state and federal level. And during this time, I had the opportunity to work with numerous hardworking men and women of law enforcement and fellow prosecutors. And because of my experience, I have immense respect for members of the law enforcement community who every day make sacrifices on behalf of all of us, and a lot of times things that go unnoticed and probably should be recognized more often. By and large, I've found that both state and federal law enforcement agents to adhere to the highest ethical standards, to have an unwavering commitment to justice and to public safety. My work with fellow prosecutors was similar, and I want to basically echo what Mr. Swecker said. I work with some of the finest attorneys at the Eastern District of Virginia. We work side by side on cases, big and small. I worked as an assistant U.S. attorney under President Bush 43, President Obama, and President Trump. And during these times, even though some priorities would change, I never saw any politicization, and often I didn't really know what the politics were of my colleagues, other than occasionally in private conversations. I was extremely proud of the work I did as a prosecutor, and I'm grateful for the opportunity I had to stand up in court, to advocate on behalf of victims, and stand and say my name on behalf of the United States. In addition to that, I gained amazing professional experiences, many friends in law enforcement, fellow prosecutors, defense attorneys, courtroom personnel, and it's an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. One of the most important things I learned, which I think is relevant here, is the tremendous responsibility that comes from being a prosecutor with every decision you make and how many people can be affected by those decisions. Sadly, the last administration, I believe, changed the prosecutor's role, and instead of focusing on public safety issues, they focus on political agendas and to advance the political agenda. This manifested itself in many of the cases the chairman spoke about earlier, and it led to a severe distrust in the criminal justice system and the FBI. Meanwhile, Americans became less safe because the focus was on political agenda rather than public safety issues. One of the most egregious examples that's been referenced a lot, but I think it's important here, is the investigation into the school boards, or the parents speaking out at the school boards. The timing of this is critical. One, it's towards the beginning of the Biden administration, so it sort of set the tone. But the other part is this occurred in October of 2021, when the election in Virginia as well as in New Jersey, the most critical issue, most important issue, was school issues involving COVID policy as well as curriculum. With some information about threats that came in, I think there's dispute about how it came in, but a lot of information that may have come in from teachers' unions and things like that. The Attorney General of the United States created a task force for these parents that consisted of the criminal division of DOJ, the Civil Rights Division, the National Security Division, the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys, the FBI, the Community Relations Service, which I didn't know existed, the Office of Justice Programs. He also ordered the U.S. attorneys, each U.S. attorney, to convene meetings with local officials to supposedly learn more about these threats, and this was within 30 days of his memo, which was early October. Coincidentally, the election with the biggest issue on the table was November of that year. After all of this attention, there was not a single federal prosecution that was brought as a result. However, the harm to the system and to the individuals was profound. The specter of law enforcement investigating what you say at a school board meeting not only intimidated parents that have spoken up, that may have wanted to speak up, but also marginalized them, so other people that might agree with their stance, when they see them labeled as terrorists, it would have a political impact. So that is one of the things I think is most egregious about the weaponization. I know my time is near, but in all of these cases, the Department of Justice had to make decisions, whether it's January 6th, whether it's the protests outside of Supreme Court justices' homes, whether or not, where to put your resources. Do you put them into public safety, or do you prosecute the 1,500th person that came in the Capitol on January 6th, while carjackers were not being prosecuted, while murderers were not being investigated fully? And that's really the issue here. The American people suffered during the last 4 years because crime was higher, and it was higher in many respects because the attention was not focused on what affected the community. Going forward, I hope this new Department of Justice will focus on issues from the bottom up, to not politicize anything, to focus on what affects people day to day on the street, whether it's fentanyl trafficking, gangs, human trafficking, other crimes of violence. I believe if they do that, the American people will be well served, they will be safer, and this will restore credibility for the Justice Department and the justice system as a whole. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Fahey. Mr. Breen, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. As noted ahead of, I'm honored to lead the Society's national litigation team. Our dedicated professionals work in states and federal courts across the country to defend the constitutional rights and really the rights of every American. Relevant to today's hearing is noted. I'm proud to have led the defense of Mark Houck for the Society, and our team has represented dozens of other pro-life Americans against the unprecedented assault on them by the Biden Department of Justice. Numerous criminal prosecutions were brought, civil cases across the country. Now, the Biden DOJ engaged in a systematic campaign to abuse the power of the federal government against pro-life advocates, while that same DOJ ignored hundreds of acts of vandalism and violence against pro-life churches, pregnancy help centers, and other advocates. On behalf of our clients and the pro-life movement as a whole, we're thankful to President Trump for his recent pardons and to the members of this House who supported that effort. Those pardons sent a powerful message to the country, and especially to the millions of Americans in the pro-life movement, that the federal government should not be weaponized against Americans because of their sincere beliefs in the sanctity of human life. We're grateful as well for the actions of the Trump DOJ, its chief of staff, who issued the memorandum directing the dismissal of the prosecutions and civil lawsuits against our clients. And that memo highlighted the fact that the Biden DOJ selectively prosecuted and enforced the law against our folks while ignoring the many acts on the other side. You may have heard some of the stories of these advocates. There's Paul Vaughn, the evangelical Christian father of 11, whose children were outside waiting to go to school when heavily armed federal agents rolled up, held his kids at bay as other agents then arrested their father. Paul didn't even block access to a clinic. He was there to give moral and spiritual support who did, but still the DOJ charged him with a FACE Act violation and a felony conspiracy against rights. While he escaped prison time, others did not. Because of that conspiracy against rights felony, we've had numerous clients who received multiple-year prison sentences, especially in Washington, D.C. Then you heard about Mark Houck. And of course, 20 federal agents at dawn directed their guns at him and his family, took him away in handcuffs. The thing is, we offered to present Mark to the prosecution, and had he been anybody but Mark Houck, we would have been allowed to do so. Instead, they spent those law enforcement resources, created an incredibly dangerous situation on his front lawn outside of Philadelphia. Now, we did beat the Biden DOJ in the Mark Houck case, winning that unanimous not guilty verdict from the Philly jury. And after that win, the DOJ from under Biden did not prosecute another sidewalk counselor. You see, because at the same time, you may not have heard, the Biden DOJ was investigating numerous other sidewalk scuffles at abortion facilities coast to coast. We had numerous clients contacted by the FBI in connection with those incidents, and had we not won for Mark, and won so definitively and publicly, we are sure that there would have been a wave of Houck-style prosecutions, federalizing minor sidewalk squabbles across the country. But now that the president has acted, the DOJ's cleaned out, and our clients' criminal records are wiped clean, well, is the matter concluded? Absolutely not. Because of the actions of the Biden DOJ, which mirror to some extent the actions of the Obama DOJ, sword of Damocles still hangs over pro-life advocates. There are long statutes of limitations on these federal laws. So folks remain in fear that some future administration will twist the law and come after them. Some of those Biden prosecutions were for actions that were taken under the first Trump administration. And the DOJ's recent dismissals were ordered on the basis of selective prosecution and did not necessarily recognize that the underlying laws don't apply to the conduct. And so, of course, while we urge the Congress to repeal the FACE Act, which is selectively and illegally enforced, we do have several other concrete steps that we would recommend. First off, as noted, this committee is very much needed because you need, respectfully, to continue to investigate and expose the misuse of the FBI and DOJ over the past 4 years against pro-life Americans. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, and this subcommittee has a lot of light to bring. Second, we would ask that you urge the Trump administration to bring to justice those who committed the violence and vandalism. If the FACE Act's to remain on the books, it should be enforced equally. And third, there are some very concrete things that the DOJ can do to properly define the scope of the FACE Act and the conspiracy against rights statutes. They can take formal written positions on those laws that will help to prevent this going forward. First off, recognize that Congress intended the FACE Act not to apply to sidewalk squabbles. That was agreed to by Senator Ted Kennedy. It's on the record from over 30 years ago. They agreed to that as part of passing this act, but it's been wiped away and ignored ever since. That needs to be recognized. Second, we need to make clear the FACE Act's physical obstruction doesn't apply to peaceable counseling activity that does not intentionally obstruct a patient or an abortion provider. The Biden DOJ advanced a contrary theory, which mirrored the Obama DOJ before it, and the New York Attorney General is continuing that action right now. That needs to stop. And again, we had said third was that recognize that FACE can't be applied to others who are not actually blocking the clinic without running afoul of the First Amendment. And fourth, get rid of this conspiracy against rights statute application because its 10-year felony provisions cannot be applied to pro-life advocates at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Breen. Mr. Ballou, you may begin.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Brennan Ballou. I serve in the Justice Department's National Security and Antitrust Divisions, and for 2 years was detailed to prosecute crimes stemming from the attack on the Capitol. It's important to remember that approximately 140 police officers were assaulted by rioters on January 6, 2021. One officer told me that he feared for his life more that day than during his entire deployment to Afghanistan in 2001. Another told me that he texted his family that afternoon because he expected to die. The work we did was about getting justice for those officers. But justice is only possible when federal prosecutors have credibility, and I want to explain how the Justice Department built that credibility over many decades and how it's being destroyed in a matter of weeks. After Watergate and the Nixon administration, Congress and the executive built protections to make it less likely that the department's powers would be abused. The offices of professional responsibility and inspector general were created. The department limited communications with the White House, and FBI officials began regularly testifying before congressional committees like this one. Investigations into activists were largely ended, and the department refocused its energy on public corruption. In the past month, the administration has largely destroyed these reforms and refocused the department away from prosecuting the corrupt and towards favoring friends and investigating enemies. To give just a few examples, most obviously, the president pardoned nearly 1,600 rioters who stormed the Capitol and its grounds in the president's name, including rioters whom I helped prosecute, who punched officers, who dragged them into the crowd, and who speared them with flagpoles. The acting D.C. U.S. attorneys threatened investigations into various perceived enemies of the administration, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and former special counsel Jack Smith. The department has largely stopped enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits bribery, prosecuting cases under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which prohibits secret work on behalf of a foreign power, or pursuing the work of the Klepto-Capture Task Force, which enforced sanctions against Russian oligarchs. The administration also threatened to fire the attorneys of the Public Integrity Section, who prosecute corrupt politicians. Now, there's now an effort to draw a false equivalency between these actions over the last month and those of recent administrations, either to argue that what is happening now is nothing new, or that if it is, it's deserved retribution. This attempt at equivalence, however, is a mistake for two reasons. First, a weaponized Justice Department endangers anyone involved in politics, no matter their political persuasion. Since the president pardoned the Capitol rioters, FBI agents have been subject to personal and specific threats of violence. But these threats have no party limits. Just this weekend at a conservative political conference, speakers considered insufficiently loyal to the president were threatened and told that pipe bombs had been planted in the building. Second, a weaponized Justice Department corrupts all of society and makes life harder and more expensive for people far from politics. For instance, the Wall Street Journal reports that executives at Twitter recently demanded that a company advertise on its platform and intimated that the government might stop or slow a proposed merger if it did not. This is an attempt to use the tools of the Justice Department to enrich one politically connected business, and it's how an oligarchy is created. The actions of the past month should concern us all, largely ending foreign bribery and corruption cases and threatening to fire public corruption prosecutors, investigating political enemies while putting political friends above the law. These are all efforts to return us to the time of Watergate, and it harms you no matter your political beliefs. The only people who will benefit from these actions will be billionaire criminals, and for them, this will be a golden age. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ballou. We're now going to proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and the chair will recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Barry Moore.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. The Biden-Harris DOJ enabled hyper-partisan prosecutors, in particular, former special counsel Jack Smith, to criminalize politics in America.
Okay.
Smith's approach to prosecutorial process raised many concerns among experts related to what his actions would mean to the future of the DOJ. In addition to his storied investigations Smith personally led, he also coordinated with Fannie Willis to help with her politically motivated prosecution of President Trump. Willis was also given disproportionate assistance from the January 6th committee, receiving records simultaneously withheld from us in Congress and law enforcement. Meanwhile, Matthew Colangelo, an attorney known for waging lawfare against Trump during his first term as president, left the elite position at the Biden-Harris DOJ to work with a Manhattan district attorney by the name of Alvin Bragg. where he led the prosecution of President Trump. Mr. Fahey, what are your thoughts generally on the investigations led by former special counsel Jack Smith?
Generally, they were, I would characterize them as heavy-handed in all respects. And, you look at this from, which is sort of the point I was trying to make, is when you're doing something, when you're focusing on something, you're not focusing on something else. But it's also heavy-handed to the way other cases are prosecuted by the Justice Department. And I think the best example of the Jack Smith case is compare that to how Robert Hur handled President Biden. You have, just when you focus on Mar-a-Lago, you have President Biden who, when he was in the Senate, managed to get a hold of classified information that shows up at his house. When he was vice president, he left office and managed to keep classified information. He kept this in his home, he kept this at the Biden Center. I think there was one other location. Robert Hur wrote a report describing all that, more than ample evidence. He described, his cognitive deficiencies, but he didn't, there were no heavy-handed measures taken. It wasn't interview everyone until the cows come home. And ultimately, he came to a measured decision for conduct that arguably is more egregious than what President Trump did, because President Trump allegedly, all of the classified information that he allegedly had, he was allowed to have it at the beginning. President Biden, at the time, was never allowed to have this information. He was also treated quite a bit differently when he turned in the information. When it first came about, which was before the election of 2022, the Justice Department kept that quiet. He turns it in through his lawyer, and then he proceeded to turn in more information over the period of the next couple of months, I think until about December. Why that's important: nobody raided his home, nobody did any heavy-handed moves. They let him turn it in at his convenience, at his leisure, and ultimately they did a consent search because it seemed like every time he turned around, there's more classified information in his house. So, and then you compare that to President Trump, where they were negotiating with NARA. They were in a far more secure location than his garage. And then you have, and how was that treated? They ran up in his house. They're searching, his wife's, where she keeps her clothes and intimate clothing and things like that to get items. And it was always under the guise of, this is so serious to get these items back because our national security is at risk. But when it was Biden, it was sort of like,
in the garage, around the car,
yeah,
and open boxes was fine.
Yeah, just swing it by when you have a chance.
Yeah, sure. So are you familiar with the 2013 IRS scandal that targeted conservative nonprofit organizations? Are you familiar with
the
that?
Lois Lerner?
Yes, and then
Yeah,
actually...
I am, but not intimately.
Well,
yes.
I understand Jack Smith, actually, he encouraged the Department of Justice to contact the IRS and continue that process of going after those conservatives wherever they may be. And Mr. Swecker, I know you served with the FBI for some time, and I appreciate your service. What about the raid to Mar-a-Lago to you stood out? I know we had some other FBI officials testify and tell us what they thought. And so as we look through this process, what about it to you stood out?
Just the fact that they did it at all. I mean, there's a lot of discretion in investigations. There's a lot of discretion in prosecutions. I was a prosecutor. I've been an agent. I know it from both angles. And I just think it was never in the best interest of the American public for them to, during negotiations, where there were a lot of issues that were being discussed between lawyers, the information, the documents were secure, and they weren't going anywhere. Unlike Hillary Clinton's server, which was the least secure place you could ever store information, is on a server that anybody can get to.
And I thought it was interesting they handled it from the Washington field office rather than the Miami field office, and they raided his home, and I kind of thought that was rather unusual.
Highly unusual, and that search was conducted over the objection of the assistant director in charge of the Washington field office.
That, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have a UC request.
Okay.
I'd ask for unanimous consent. I'd like to enter into the record the full transcript with Stephen D. Tuno, I may be saying that incorrectly, Antuano, the assistant director in charge of FBI's Washington field office.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. I've got one more, sorry. I'd also like to introduce an article titled "Donald Trump Stored, Showed Off, and Refused to Return Classified Documents, Indictments."
Without objection.
Thank you so much.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for your testimony today. Let's see. You know, Trump is purging experienced career civil servants and filling their roles with inexperienced sycophants who will do whatever they are told to do, no matter how unlawful or unconstitutional the ask. And the American people are focused on that real threat to our democracy and to the rule of law that is posed by this Trump administration. And so they are too smart to be distracted by Republicans' tired conspiracy theories. And that is exactly what we're getting today. Now, Mr. Ballou, you're familiar with Danielle Sassoon, are you not?
I am, sir.
And you know her to be a Federalist Society member?
She is.
A former law clerk to Antonin Scalia?
She is.
Anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-civil rights, a blazing right-wing extremist. Isn't that correct?
He was an extremely conservative jurist.
And, no, I'm talking about Danielle Sassoon.
I can't speak to Ms. Sassoon's personal opinions about those specific legal issues.
She is, as you described, Justice Scalia, but even she could not stomach the prospect of being a party to a quid pro quo in the Eric Adams case, could she?
No, sir.
You know, dropping charges for illegitimate reasons. She didn't want to have a hand in that. She was too principled to participate in that. And because we know that when you drop charges against someone for a illegitimate purpose, a quid pro quo, Eric Adams, to force him over a barrel to carry out your deportation political agenda in return for dropping the charges against him eventually, but hanging it over his head with a dismissal without prejudice. She did not want to be a party to such an illegitimate bargain. And we know that if you'll drop a charge, you'll also institute charges for political purposes, for illegitimate purposes. Is that not the essence of weaponizing the Justice Department?
Yeah, absolutely, sir. You know, the concern here is that criminal prosecutions would be used to achieve unrelated policy objectives in the case of the Eric Adams scandal. You know, the reason that we don't do that is because the powers of prosecutors are so vast that once that happens, people will follow government directives not because they want to or believe in it, but simply because they fear retribution if they don't.
Thank you. In your testimony, you talked about how this administration has corrupted the guardrails that existed in the Department of Justice with respect to reforms put in place after the abuse during the Republican Nixon administration. And you talked about how guardrails that would have been destroyed insofar as favoring friends of this administration. What did you mean by that specifically?
Yeah. Well, I think we're seeing this in the Wall Street Journal reporting about potentially X or Twitter trying to get advertisers back on their site, and if they don't, well, then the government will investigate them and potentially stop a merger.
The co-president of the United States, who, by the way, was unelected and hails from apartheid South Africa, trying to leverage his position as co-president to gain something for his platform that spews mis and disinformation publicly.
And when the government is used in that way, it harms everybody, far from politics, because it increases prices and it interferes with the free economy.
Yeah, I can't think of a greater threat to democracy than a guy like Elon Musk set free or set loose by a president, Donald Trump, who was duly elected but has outsourced now and privatized his administration to a oligarch billionaire and his other billionaire buddies. With that, I'll yield back.
Okay. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Swecker, when did you first become aware of the FBI's memo targeting traditional Roman Catholics?
Well, I don't know the exact date, but it was when it hit the press. I mean, as soon as it hit the press, I mean, I found out about it when everybody else did.
Did you get the opportunity to review the memo, that came from the Virginia field office? Did you take a look at it?
I did. I don't remember all the details in it, but it was a very ill-advised memo.
Did it strike you?
Yeah, of course it did.
In a bad way?
I think it would strike anybody in a bad way. I'm Catholic, not that that matters, but just singling out a religion and religious beliefs in the way that they did. I mean, frankly, though, I don't know how much play that really got further up the food chain, but it was it just demonstrated incredibly poor judgment.
We asked the then Attorney General about it. We asked the then FBI Director about it. They both, in essence, apologized, but it said it was only limited to the Virginia field office. And then, fortunately, there were other whistleblowers. We got information. It wasn't only limited. This was starting to go throughout the country. Thank God we found out about it. And as I said before, my good Hindu friends, men of peace, people, human beings of peace, have never would do anything harmful. If it happened to Roman Catholics, and I happen to be Roman Catholic as well, it can happen to anyone.
I think it does reflect that there were some ideologues deep in the it wasn't just the leadership in the Bureau.
You can't believe otherwise. I mean, it just didn't make sense. It was shocking for America. Do you believe the memo infringed on Americans' rights under our Constitution to some degree?
Absolutely, especially if they had followed through on it aggressively, like they did other things.
Stated, let me read this, I'm quoting now, catalyzing events in which regionally motivated violent extremists and radical traditional Catholics. I'm not sure what the hell that means, to be honest with you.
They were calling them domestic terrorists.
Yeah,
essentially.
I don't know. I try to go to Mass when I can. I honest to God, I don't see I don't see any domestic terrorists there. And they said they might have a common clause including legislation or judicial decisions in areas such as abortion rights, immigration, affirmative action, and LGBTQ protections. Isn't that their right? And is it typical for the FBI to dig into something like that?
Not the FBI I served under. And I think Chris Wray made a lot of mistakes, but he apologized for that one. I think that's one that got away from, should never even...
I think they were even shocked that they had that level of an ideologue, actually. And I believe that they were being sincere. I know the Attorney General at the time almost cried. Maybe he did a little bit, actually. Do you think the FBI needs stricter controls over how these bulletins are created and distributed? Hopefully they will now.
I do. I mean, a lot of it's judgment-based, and it's who you hire and the examples that are set at the top of in this case, the FBI. I mean, you can't, there's no substitute for just good judgment as things. I saw a lot of junk come out of a squad room, reports and that sort of thing, and if you're at the supervisory level, you just cancel it out. You squelch it right there.
Okay. So I'm going to ask the three of you, Mr. Swecker, Mr. Fay, Mr. Breen, some real quick questions. That's something I'll always like to do. I like to get to the point. It's either yes or no, not a long answer on this. I'll start with you, Mr. Swecker. Do you believe the DOJ was weaponized against political opponents, yes or no?
Yes, I think there's many examples of that.
Mr. Fay.
Yes, I do.
Mr. Breen.
Yes, absolutely.
Should federal law enforcement agencies surveil parents at school board meetings, yes or no, Mr. Swecker?
No.
No.
Was it appropriate for a DOJ official to pressure a defense lawyer with a judgeship offer? Yes or no, Mr. Swecker?
No.
If that happened, no.
And it did. We have.
Yeah, I've heard
Let-
information,
yeah.
I just don't know definitively, but yes.
Correct, outrageous.
Is it acceptable for the FBI to categorize certain religious groups in the way that they did? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
I think everybody, God help us, agrees on that one. Even my friends on the other side of the aisle here might. Do you believe there is currently, or was currently, that there was a two-tiered system of justice in America? Yes or no?
Yes, many examples of that.
There's so many.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, we live through it.
Thank you. I think it makes our point, and I'm almost out of time myself. Ms. Crockett, the ranking member. I'm sorry, Mr. Moskowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming to today's hearing entitled Entering the Golden Age. Probably named it that because the price of eggs is the price of gold. But here we are. Chairman Drew mentioned something. He said the People's Justice Department. I actually think that's very important. Unfortunately, the DC U.S. Attorney Ed Martin disagrees with him because he calls himself Trump's attorney, his own words and his own statements. He doesn't say the people's attorney. He doesn't say the Justice Department's attorney. He said he's President Trump's lawyer. And so it seems to me that those two things are not accurate. Mr. Swacker, you think a U.S. attorney is the president's attorney or the Department of Justice's attorney?
It's people's attorney.
The people's attorney, okay.
The president has a White House counsel.
Okay, right. Okay, so I just want to clear that up. Maybe someone should, send a quick email to Ed Martin. Maybe we can get someone in DOJ to do that. They like emailing people with like 5 things to do. Maybe like someone could say like, hey, Mr. Martin, of the 5 things to do, number 1, make sure you know who your client is. It's America, not the president. He's also sending letters to members of Congress. Are you aware of that, Mr. Fahey?
Yes.
Yeah,
I think if you're referring to the Chuck Schumer letter, yes?
No, he's sending letters to member of the House asking them to clarify statements.
When he made those
Yeah.
statements or...
Which is weird because literally that same week he sent the letter, like this committee literally held a whole hearing on free speech, right? And then all of a sudden the DC attorney is sending letters asking members of Congress to clarify.
Those are tricky situations. The Schumer thing, if that was not Chuck Schumer and just a regular person outside of the Supreme Court, I believe that person would at least be investigated for threats, whether or not it comes out. And those are tricky, but I don't think those are so clear cut because you don't have a free speech right to threaten people, threaten justice.
No, of course not.
I don't see, I see your point and that may be how it breaks out, but I don't think it's inappropriate to look a step further in those types of things.
We're hearing a lot about weaponization, and my colleagues across the other aisle, they're the bravado party. Like, we can admit that, right? Like, the Republicans just have a lot more bravado than Democrats, and I'm okay admitting that. But they seem to just not wanting to, they're like coy on this one. They're not interested in ending the weaponization of the DOJ. They want to continue it. In fact, the deep state gave them a bad idea, and they're going to run with it. And in fact, not only are they going to run with it, man, they're going to do it even better than the deep state. They just hired pacifist Don Bongino, right? Like Dan Bongino, that seems to be very against this idea that we want to end weaponization. Dan, who says Americans are having a Cold War amongst themselves, who says that the only thing that matters is power, a system of checks and balances. That's a good one. That doesn't seem to be someone that wants to end the weaponization. It seems someone who is going to be given power and wants to continue the weaponization. I have a question. Will you gentlemen all come back in, let's say, a year and give us your assessment of whether or not we have ended the weaponization? We'll do like this, like a quick, like, okay, you're here now, and then like a year later you'll come back and we'll be like, by the way, mission accomplished. We'll get a big banner, we'll fly a plane, and mission accomplished. Or will you come back and admit, like, it looks like it's continuing to go on? Okay.
That's
not all at once.
Depending on the scheduling, sure.
Yeah.
We don't have to pick a date now, that's fine.
We'll get it.
I thought it was a rhetorical question, but yeah, we'll
It
come
was
back.
rhetorical. Okay, fair. Someone is paying attention. So I just, like, there's got to be at least one of my colleagues who like can get in front of the camera and be the tough guy and just be like, you know, we're not ending the weaponization. No. The deep state started it, man. We're gonna run with it, because we've already seen that in the appointments in the first couple of weeks. I don't need honesty because we're in Congress, but what I want is, we already know, like, the American people know, they know this, right? We don't need to hide, just tell the American people what they know. Revenge tour is coming. We're gonna have tour dates. We're gonna show up, we're gonna play arenas, but the DOJ revenge tour is coming. Thank you.
Okay. Two things. I would love to have you back in a year. Let's try to make that a date. It may not be exactly 1 year. It could be 11 months. It could be 13 months. Oh, I think, I think you scared them a little bit. I bet you all would be willing to come, including you, Mr. Ballou. Secondly, real quick, Mr. Moskowitz, I love your sense of humor. You got to always have a sense of humor as you go through things. You're pretty good at it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I have a unanimous consent. I'd like to introduce for the record the letter from the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General related to the Richmond memo that stated, we did not find evidence
Without
that anyone
objection.
ordered or objected to find a link between racially motivated.
Without objection.
Okay. I'd also like to introduce an article titled Jim Jordan's New Myth in Anti-Catholic FBI.
Without objection.
And the final one I'd like to introduce is an article from Fox News noting that the FBI was absolved of malicious intent in the Catholic memo incident.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Some people wrote a bad memo. Anyhow, I now recognize a gentleman from the great state of Missouri, Dr. Onder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today. Mr. Breen, on September 23rd, 2022, the FBI raided the home of your client, Mark Hauk, following indictment, charging FACE Act violations based on an alleged shoving incident that took place where he was defending his son near an abortion clinic. Mr. Breen, if my memory serves right, other prosecutors had looked at that case, the Hauk case, prior to this SWAT team raid. Could you refresh my memory on that?
Yes, Congressman. And in fact, it had been prosecuted through the state level system, and the charges were dropped because the complaining witness refused to show up.
Right.
In fact, he'd gone on vacation one time. One time, he actually went to the abortion facility to escort, and when Mark arrived, they went to court. No, he wasn't there. Mark arrived, said, did you enjoy your morning at court? This guy was the complaining witness.
Yeah.
And so that was looked through there. But even on the federal side, they had started in front of a grand jury and went fallow. It just stopped.
Right.
But then the Dobbs leak hits, all this, and we watched it then restart up, and they get out an indictment. So that it was clearly something that was related to trying to make a point on abortion,
right,
not because he had actually committed a crime.
So dropped on the state level, dropped on the federal level, and resurrected. And then did your client do something like violent or threaten someone or something to merit 25 SWAT officers that morning?
No, and in fact, so I can show you the email from my colleague, who was a former federal prosecutor, 15 years in Arizona. He had corresponded with the local U.S. attorney who had requested response. Said, hey, if you want, we'll present him. We're glad to. He's represented. Certainly no need. There wasn't a need to send 25 officers. I mean, for heaven's sakes, you send one or two to the door and knock on it if you really want to go arrest him.
Right.
But I mean, this was outrageous, and we've seen video of it. I mean,
or maybe talk to his lawyer and ask him to appear in court.
Right. Well, and this was our thing. Our local lawyer said, if this guy was anyone but him, he would have been brought in to present. I mean, they let people that are much, much more dangerous and violent present. I mean, Mark did something, and we found out after we went into the case, we realized no one had gone back into the legislative history of the FACE Act. Senator Kennedy and Senator Durenberger, literally on the floor of the Senate, cut a deal and said, we are not getting in the middle of the sidewalk squabbles.
Right.
And I got to tell you, he's a good Republican. We don't like legislative history. It's a thing for the Republicans.
Right.
I'm a former legislator. I love legislative history. And for heaven's sakes, for you guys, I mean, you guys in the Congress did this. So
Right.
I think you should be asserting your rights to say, stop it. You are
Right.
expanding this law beyond our intent.
Right, right. And so if Mark Houck wasn't the kind of defendant or the suspect that would merit this kind of treatment, this must have been the Department of Justice sending a political message on abortion.
Maine Justice sent people in to the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And look, Philadelphia's a rough area.
Right.
In fact, our trial judge, who was an experienced prosecutor, he's former Pennsylvania Attorney General, he said, I have never, in my time on the bench, had Maine Justice send someone out to prosecute a case in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania.
Well, let me talk about another case of a very dangerous criminal defendant you might be familiar with, Mr. Houck. On January 23rd, President Trump announced the pardons for 23 pro-life advocates. One of these was Eva Edel, who at 89 years old faced a sentence of up to 11 years in federal prison. Eva was a Soviet concentration camp survivor who was charged with singing and praying from her wheelchair at the entrance to an abortion facility. In 2022, at least 26 pro-life advocates faced federal charges for FACE Act violations. The same year, pregnancy resource centers experienced serious attacks, firebombings, and yet, to my knowledge, did not face any FACE Act prosecutions from the Biden Justice Department. Am I correct on that?
Yes, Congressman. I have specifically in mind a client in upstate New York, firebombed their facility. It took them $500,000 to rebuild it. And they told them, oh, we can't figure out who did it. And we can't get any answers from the police. We couldn't even get our surveillance video back. And it was outrageous when you look at the amount of federal resources that are spent on our clients, that they couldn't even find these terrorists, actual, literal domestic terrorists.
So again, aggressive prosecutorial action against pro-lifers, none against actual arsonists, domestic terrorists. Would that be a politicization of the Justice Department?
Absolutely. That's a politicization, and it's one that can be fixed with the new DOJ and under the guidance of this subcommittee.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Maryland, Mr. Raskin, the ranking member.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've got decades of excellent government, law enforcement experience represented at the table. Unfortunately, I've only got 5 minutes, so I want to go very quickly. I want to ask a few yes or no questions, and I'll start with you, Mr. Pallone, and go down. In your time as a prosecutor, have you been aware of any case where prosecutors have been fired or otherwise disciplined in office for having worked on a particular case that they were assigned to before January 6th?
Not until the last month.
Mr. Fahey, Mr. Breen, you were not a prosecutor, as I understand.
No,
Okay,
defense.
Mr. Fahey, in your years of government law enforcement, were you aware of any prosecutors who ever were disciplined or demoted or fired because they'd worked on a particular case before January 6th?
For being assigned to a case or beyond that? I know of people that may have been disciplined by their work on a case, but by me.
I'm not talking about misconduct on a case,
But just by being assigned.
Just by virtue of being on a team.
I don't know of any.
Okay, Mr. Swecker, did you ever encounter that in your many years on the FBI?
Not based on mere assignment of a case. I will note that, at the end of an administration, U.S. attorneys routinely submit their resignations and usually are fired.
Right, but in terms of line prosecutors, civil service lawyers, you're not, or FBI agents rather, you're not aware of any. And okay, let me continue with you for a sec. Have you heard of a case where participation as an FBI agent in a particular case is grounds for dismissal or demotion, just for having worked on a particular case?
No, absent misconduct.
Okay. Mr. Blue, back to you. So a number of attorneys, around 24, I think, have been sacked just because they worked on a particular case, even if they are civil service people, which means you can't be fired for political reasons. You can only be fired for poor performance or misconduct. But I think all of the dozen attorneys who worked for Jack Smith, and a dozen attorneys were fired, I think, on the very first day because they had worked on the January 6th prosecution. Will you describe what you think the lawfulness of that is, and then also what effect that will have on morale and cohesion within the ranks of lawyers who work at the Department of Justice?
It certainly seems unlawful in that these people were being fired not because of misconduct, but because of simply the cases that they were working on, essentially viewpoint discrimination. You know, the effect is profound. You know, these attorneys weren't just working on January 6 cases. They were working on other cases within the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. So,
And it's not viewpoint discrimination based on any of the viewpoints they had. We have no idea what their viewpoints were. It was viewpoints based on the people who've come into the office who think that somehow it's a badge of stigma or shame to have worked on a particular case.
precisely.
There were 6,000 FBI agents who worked on January 6th, which was the most massive violent mob attack on the United States Congress and the peaceful transfer of power and the vice president in American history. What do you think about the idea that somehow there's an attempt to demonize and vilify people for having done their jobs in working on it?
Yeah, I think if they are demonized, if they're fired, it's going to be devastating for the FBI because these are folks that are working on counterterrorism, counterespionage, and other cases.
Yeah. So, Mr. Fayed, one other question for you. Do you think that the idea of sacking all of these lawyers simply because of having worked on a particular case will promote public safety in the District of Columbia or undermine public safety in the District of Columbia?
If people are being fired just for because I know the hypothetical, I don't know why individuals were fired and that there's conduct or if things are interrelated. I think overall the morale is going to be far higher because morale is rock bottom at DOJ, rock bottom at the FBI under the prior administration.
In the last 4 weeks, I agree with you on that.
No. During the prior administration, if you bring in some law enforcement agents,
All right, we'll have a separate hearing on that. We'll get back to you on that one. Mr. Ballou,
you've got to talk to them because they.
all right, we'll have you back, I promise.
Very
I would
low.
love nothing more.
Yeah.
Mr. Ballou, let me come back to you. I've heard, I was there January 6th, so I know that was something that really happened. Officer Brian Sicknick really died from strokes that he had based on the violence visited on him being sprayed in the face with noxious chemicals. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and I'll take anyone with the Sicknick family over there to see him. This is not some kind of a mirage. This really happened. 140 of our officers were smashed in the face with Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, broken furniture, steel pipes, you name it. There were heart attacks, traumatic brain injury. I've got constituents who've never recovered from the wounds that took place there. Sergeant Cannell had to leave But when we talk about it, then I hear about the prosecution and vilification of parents, of mothers and fathers. And hey, I'm a father. My kids went to public school. That doesn't sound very good to me. So I try to get to the bottom of this because I've been hearing about it for 5 years now. And I ask myself, what are they talking about? So I get the memo, which was from Attorney General Merrick Garland, and it begins, I don't have time to read the whole thing. There's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, teachers, board members, and staff. The word mother or father don't appear. The word parent doesn't appear here. There's all of this propaganda about some prosecution of parents is based on absolutely nothing. This is just made up out of thin air. So I will submit this for the record. The memo, though, all of this goes back to Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much.
Without objection. The chair recognizes, I'll see who I'm recognizing. The chair recognizes Mr. Schmidt from the great state of Kansas. See, I remembered that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll be on the exam at the end. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses who I know have covered a wide range of subject matter today. I had a couple of questions regarding the school board matter, which I'm not sure has been focused upon perhaps as much as I might have thought it would have been. This is, of course, the matter from 2021 where the National School Board Association, oddly, in my view, requested that the President of the United States initiate a federal law enforcement investigation of, in effect, parents who had shown up at a variety of school board meetings around the country. In my view, understandably, they were distressed by some very difficult and I think ill-advised decisions that were made regarding masking, regarding shutting kids out of school, regarding a variety of other very unusual practices that occurred during the COVID period, and wanted to express their views on that to their locally elected officials who were making those decisions, perhaps much as we're doing here in a different scale. It struck me as very odd that we had, at the time, that we had this private association asking for a federal law enforcement investigation and that they directed their request to the President of the United States. So much so that at the time I was serving as Attorney General in Kansas, and about 3 weeks after that request came in and the Department of Justice had directed, as I recall, some of the local offices to take certain actions in terms of, I think, responding to threats was their top line, rather an odd assertion given that there weren't any actual threats asserted in the request. A group of us, 17, I believe, state attorneys general, wrote to the President and to the then U.S. Attorney General, Mr. Garland, on October 18th and asked them, in effect, what are you doing and why are you doing it? We expressed in that a concern that they were being asked to intervene in what we called a quintessentially local issue, which is the public safety in the room of a public governing body that was local. And we asked that the President and the then Attorney General and others under their direction take our point of view that local authorities were perfectly capable of handling any threats in these local meetings, as they do each and every day all over the country without this sort of fanfare. There were then some additional steps, and the School Board Association, as I recall, backed off a bit of what they had asked for, and then about a week after that, on October the 26th, a smaller but still substantial group of 14 of us followed up with a second letter to the President and to the Attorney General asking that they take a look at the School Board Association's actions and how those requests that were very odd had come to pass. So a handful of questions for our witnesses. I'll start with Mr. Swecker, but perhaps also Mr. Fahey. In the course of all this, it came to light that there had been conversations between people at the White House and the School Board Association, functionally consulting on the drafting of this letter that then requested a federal law enforcement investigation. In your experience, is that ordinary for the White House to be involved with a third-party outside organization and asking that federal law enforcement engage on a matter?
I can't come up with any examples of it during my tenure. And the most disturbing thing about it was that it was rolled out as a national initiative. It wasn't just an isolated instance where someone came in and said, I'm going to set up a bomb in this meeting. It was people, just like city council meetings and county commission meetings and boards of trustee meetings across the country, that's where people exercise their First Amendment rights. And clearly this went way, way beyond that in the form of a national level initiative.
Have you ever seen anything like it?
No.
Mr. Fahey?
I've never seen anything like it. And another thing that's striking about this, if you look at DOJ, and they put together a task force on things like drug trafficking, terrorism, human trafficking, it's usually major things. And this was all of a sudden, whatever information they had, they nationalized this with task force and every U.S. attorney elevating it to a level, and I'm sure you all know, threats are fairly common. I'm sure what you do, and I dealt with them all the time at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the idea that anything would have risen to this level was really, it just shows it was political in nature, because as you know, the issue of the day of that November election, both in New Jersey as well as Virginia, was that educational issue.
Did any federal prosecutions result from this use of resources?
My understanding was none. And that's the other thing. If you put that much resources into it, the fact that you would come up with nothing, it just shows that there probably was nothing there to begin with.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I just have a UC request.
Yes, without objection.
There are four articles. One is Reuters, school boards get death threats amid rage over race, gender, mask policies. That's February 15, 2022. Quote, I don't want to die for it.
Without objection.
School board members face rising threats, New York Times, November 5, 2021. A transcript with a former DOJ official describing deadly threats. And finally, this note that appeared in the New York Times. It's too bad that your mama is an ugly communist whore. If she doesn't quit or
Without
resign
objection.
for another year, we will kill her, which was on the windshield of a
objection.
school board member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will now recognize the ranking member from the great state of Texas, Ms. Crockett.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to level set on a few things because my head has been spinning from some of the testimony that we have heard today. So just to level set really quickly, all of you have been involved with the criminal justice system in some way at some point in time in your lives. As it relates to January 6th, I just want to be clear. If anyone was incarcerated because of what happened on January 6th, they either went to trial or they entered pleas of guilty. Is that true or false? I'll start with you, Mr. Swecker.
I really don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
That's fine.
Yeah.
Mr.
Well,
Fahey?
there would be
Yes
the-
or no, Mr. Fahey? I ain't got that
Well,
much
it's
time.
not a yes or no.
Okay,
There were-
then
there
I'll
were
move
people that
on.
were incarcerated
I'm gonna
pre-trial,
reclaim my time. I'm gonna reclaim my
So
time.
that's a separate category, but the people that were sentenced and incarcerated, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Breen?
Yeah, I'm assuming that that was the process, although I understand the trials were not fair.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Mr. Ballou?
Every January 6th defendant who was incarcerated was charged or found guilty.
Thank you so much. It's interesting that we're not having a conversation around January 6th, and we're talking about school boards, and we're talking about people that never ended up being arrested. We're talking about the process seemingly working because there were people that felt like there should be an investigation, but ultimately they did not feel like there was anything that warranted going forward. But I can tell you for sure that we as Americans watched in despair because we did not know what was going to happen on January 6th. And as a result, over 1,000 people were arrested and or convicted. But the first day, the first priority that the sitting president had was to release these criminals. So while we're talking about whether or not we're going to be safe, I want to clarify these weren't little innocent folk that were running around and were persecuted as it was made out to be. In fact, we know that the day after one of those defendants got out, he was rearrested on a firearm charge. We know that soon after another defendant got out, he was arrested for child solicitation. We know that after another one got out, he was actually killed by law enforcement in a confrontation. And we know that after another one got out, she was sentenced because of a fatal car crash that she caused. So I want to be clear. In this country, we should believe in law and order. And I am going to be honest because much like Mr. Breen, the only time that I ever entered a criminal courthouse was in defense of someone, in defense of the accused. And it is because I believe in the Constitution. I believe that everyone has the right to due process. And as a defense attorney, I should show up ready, and I am hoping that the system works. But I say hoping because nothing on this earth is perfect. And one of the things that I actually used to take a lot of issue with was the fact that I did believe that there was a two-tier justice system. This is not something that the black community somehow woke up and said, oh, this is a new thing, although we're talking about it and we're meaning it in different ways because all of a sudden you had somebody with more power than arguably anyone in the world, and somehow Lady Justice found him too. And I say Lady Justice somehow found him because it was grand juries that had to indict him. And then ultimately, he was found guilty of 34 counts of felonies, at least in one courthouse. We know that the other cases never proceeded for various reasons. We also know that when he entered into civil courthouses, he was found liable for various things. Listen, I don't want to have the American people get it twisted. I don't want them to be confused and believe that just because somebody is a prosecutor or just because somebody brings a case, that somehow that is weaponization. If they bring it forward and if the justice system works the way that it's supposed to be, Mr. Breen, you talked about how your client was found not guilty, and I'm guessing that you accept that jury's verdict.
Certainly.
You accept that jury's verdict for your client?
Absolutely.
Okay,
but
okay,
didn't
but
tell
I
you about the
got to
DC
move
jury.
on to a few other things really quickly. Christopher Wray. Mr. Ballou, do you know who that is?
Yes.
Was Christopher Wray appointed by Joe Biden?
No, he was appointed by President Trump.
He was appointed by President Trump. Now, Christopher Wray, for those that don't know, was the head of the FBI. And Christopher Wray, was he fired by Joe Biden just because Joe Biden was a Democrat that came in?
No.
In fact, Christopher Wray left the FBI when Trump threatened to fire him, but Christopher Wray still had time on the clock, didn't he?
He did.
So any prosecutions that took place, they actually took place under the Wray FBI department. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the last thing, I know, Mr. Chair, I'm running out of time, just real quick. The last thing that I want to ask, because we've talked about the mayor of New York, is he a Democrat or a Republican?
He's a Democrat.
And he was prosecuted under a Democratic DOJ or a Republican DOJ?
A Democratic DOJ.
Thank you so much, and I will yield. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Ranking Member. You know, real quickly, if it wasn't for this committee and what revealed about parents happening to parents in schools and what happening to parishioners in churches by whistleblowers, God knows what would have happened. It was just through the work, actually, that we did here. So the justice system, again, was not working at that time. With that, I will yield to the chairman of the Committee of the Whole, Mr. Jordan from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Swecker, how long were you at the FBI?
24 years.
24 years. Distinguished career?
I'd like to think so.
I think so, too. Assistant Director of the Criminal Division, that's a pretty darn important position you held. In that time at the FBI, did you ever deal with confidential human sources?
Yes.
Regular basis?
Yes.
What can you tell me? Well, let's frame it this way. 26 of them were there on January 6, 2021. And we know at least 17 of them did something they weren't authorized to do. Is that typical?
I wouldn't say it's atypical. I mean, informants are generally in the criminal mix, so they often find themselves in places where their crime's taking place, yeah.
So it was okay for them to do something they weren't authorized to do on January 6th?
No. There's a process for the FBI to authorize ordinary criminal activity, and it has to be in, you know, they're very structured about how they handle informants. If an SAC, a special agent in charge, authorizes ordinary criminal activity, it's going to be in the file.
And have you read the Inspector General's report on these 26 confidential human sources?
Not the entire report.
But according to the Inspector General, they were not authorized to do so. They were not authorized to enter the restricted space, certainly not authorized to go in the Capitol.
Right.
And we know 17 entered restricted space, 4 went in the Capitol. Yeah. How does it normally work? Do you think these guys were I'm just asking as an expert, 24 years, Assistant Director of the Criminal Division, you think these guys were paid for what they were involved with or what they did or what they witnessed, how they informed, whatever they did on the 6th? Do you think they were paid by the taxpayers?
By the time they're fully vetted informants, they generally are paid to be where they are.
So certainly the two, or is it fair to say the two who were asked to be there by the FBI that particular day were probably on the payroll?
I would say yes.
Okay,
I think
so
that's
they
a
were
good
being
guess.
paid by the taxpayer, most likely being paid by the, well, to be fair, most likely being paid by the taxpayer, and they went, 2 of these 4 went into the Capitol who were being paid, or who were asked to be there. So they're asked to be by the FBI, likely being paid, and they did something they weren't allowed to do.
Right.
And why was it that every time Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, came in front of the committee over the last several years, and we'd have some Republican members would ask him about any confidential, why was he so reluctant to just say, yes, they were there?
I think it was an embarrassing thing for the Bureau, for the public to know that they had that many informants on the premises.
No procedure, nothing prohibiting from him telling us. We're not asking for their names. We're not asking to identify.
Right.
We certainly don't, we understand that's part of your
Right.
investigative techniques and tactics. But there was nothing prohibiting Christopher Wray from telling us, yeah, there were confidential human sources there that day.
There was nothing prohibiting that I know of.
But he went out of his way to make sure we couldn't get that information. And then we didn't get that information, frankly, until after the election, 4 years later. They didn't need to wait 4 years to tell us what they knew on January 7th.
Right.
Well, actually, they knew on January 6th because they asked some of these people to be there.
It's pretty extraordinary because my mind goes to prevention. If they had that many informants out there, what were they doing and why weren't they reporting on what was going on ahead of time, and why didn't the FBI take steps to prevent what happened?
Because if these guys were helping actually doing what they're supposed to do, we might have prevented some of the things that took place that day is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Fahey, is it appropriate for with the special counsel, Mr. Jay Bratt, to say to a defendant's counsel, to say that we didn't know you were a Trump guy, and we thought you would do the right thing, and we understand you're interested in this judge position? Is that appropriate behavior from someone in the special counsel saying to a defendant's counsel?
That would be highly inappropriate.
That is as bad as it gets, isn't it?
That would seem, I don't recall anything even remotely comparable or even hearing of anything.
But Stanley
remotely
Woodward, who this happened to.
Right, and I know it's shocking to me when I heard it, and it was only until I heard it multiple times that it was like.
One of the many things that were shocking about this special counsel, the idea that in the special counsel case in Florida, they mixed up the stuff that they got, they screwed it up and had to file with the court. Oh, the classified documents that we said Mr. Trump, that President Trump mishandled, we actually mishandled. They had to file that with the court, didn't they?
Yeah, and it's sort of the irony of it all, of holding one standard to President Trump and a lower standard, not only for them, but also.
One last question for the three of you. Why all the pre-dawn raids? What they did to Mr. Houck, what they did to Brian Malinowski. I mean, let's assume I'm not sure Brian Malinowski did anything wrong, but let's assume he did. Had 6 firearms, sold 6 firearms he wasn't supposed to sell. Why in the world would you knock on his door, have 10 cars pull up, coordinate with local police, put the tape on the doorbell cam and do what they did, which resulted in his loss of life? Why would you do that? We'll start with Mr. Breen, since you haven't answered anything yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, the outrageous thing, too, so they overdo it. And I got to tell you, I asked for body cam footage from the feds. They're not wearing the body cams. They're not on. The only people I could get was from the Pennsylvania State Police. They gave me a full video.
Yeah, you're talking Mr. Houck. You're talking about Mark.
For
in case
Mark
you had.
Houck.
Understand.
So
understand.
You can't even figure out, what are these folks doing? You know, they tape the Ring doorbell.
Well, they did the same thing. The point is, the consistency, and they did the same thing with Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Houck was acquitted by the jury, found not guilty by the jury. Mr. Malinowski wound up dead because he thought he was being robbed, and he defended his home and then was shot in the head and died a few hours later. It's terrible what happened. And you know the interesting thing about the Malinowski case? They were surveilling him for weeks. They were all set to go do this raid pre-dawn still the week before, and they found out he wasn't there. They were going to get the firearms. He doesn't need to be there. Why in the world would you do that and jeopardize life? And of course, the worst thing happens. Mr. Schwecker, would you? That's not how it's supposed to operate, is it?
No. You know, most of the time you do a couple hours of surveillance, you get the routines down, you catch them walking out to the car when they're unaware.
You know,
maximum drama is the only thing that you could surmise.
The only explanation could be that because they followed him and they could have went to the airport where he worked, where everyone knew. It was so ridiculous. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this hearing, and thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. That concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses for appearing before us and the time they spent. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
I had 2 UCs, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, let's do it.
Thank you. I'd ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from Reuters. FBI did not send undercover operatives to join January 6th attack.
Without objection.
Says, as well as an article from the New York Times. FBI did not send informants to encourage Capitol riots.
Without objection.
Thank you so much.
The hearing is adjourned. Thanks.
Hey, really nice to meet you.